Hi there, I'm Machine Pun Kelly, aka MPK. Today I want to talk about the third case in a six-part series covering the Supreme Court history on rulings involving non-citizens. Today, let's talk about Yamataya versus Fisher, which is also called the Japanese immigrant case. Yamataya v. Fisher, 1903, also known as the Japanese immigrant case, was a significant U.S. Supreme Court case that established due process protections for non-citizens, including undocumented immigrants, in deportation proceedings under the Fifth Amendment. Historical context setting. United States, early 1900s. The early 20th century was a period of increasing immigration to the U.S., with significant numbers of Japanese immigrants arriving on the West Coast, particularly in California, to work in agriculture, railroads, and other industries. By 1900, over 24,000 Japanese immigrants lived in the U.S., many facing racial hostility similar to that experienced by Chinese immigrants. Anti-Asian sentiment fueled restrictive immigration policies. While the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 targeted Chinese laborers, Japanese immigration was not yet restricted by federal law, but local and state governments often enacted discriminatory measures, such as alien land laws. The Immigration Act of 1891 established federal control over immigration, creating the Bureau of Immigration and allowing deportation of aliens who entered unlawfully or became public charges. Enforcement was largely administrative, with immigration officers conducting summary hearings without judicial oversight, raising concerns about fairness. Immigration enforcement. Deportation proceedings at the time were swift and lacked standardized procedures. Immigrants could be deported based on vague criteria, such as being likely to become a public charge, often without notice or a meaningful opportunity to contest the decision. Japanese immigrants, like Kaoru Yamataya, were particularly vulnerable to these practices, as they faced both racial prejudice and economic instability, making them targets for deportation under discretionary standards. Case background parties involved. Kaoru Yamataya, a Japanese immigrant, likely a young woman, records are unclear on her exact age or background, who entered the U.S. in 1901 and was ordered deported as a public charge. John H. Fisher, the immigration inspector in Seattle, Washington, representing the federal government's enforcement of deportation orders under the Immigration Act. Kaoru Yamataya arrived in the U.S. in July 1901, landing in Seattle. 4 days after her arrival, immigration officials detained her, alleging she was likely to become a public charge, a ground for deportation under the Immigration Act of 1891. Yamataya, who reportedly spoke little English, was subjected to a summary administrative hearing by an immigration officer. She was not informed of her right to counsel, given inadequate notice of the charges, or provided an interpreter, limiting her ability to contest the allegations. The officer ordered her deportation, and Yamataya filed a habeas corpus petition, arguing that the summary process violated her Fifth Amendment due process rights. Lower federal courts upheld the deportation order, citing Congress's plenary power over immigration. Yamataya appealed to the Supreme Court. Did the administrative deportation process, which lacked notice, a fair hearing, or access to counsel, violate the Fifth Amendment's due process clause for an alien who had entered the U.S., even unlawfully? To what extent do due process protections apply to deportation proceedings for non-citizens within U.S. jurisdiction? The Supreme Court upheld Yamataya's deportation order, but established that non-citizens within the U.S., even those who entered unlawfully, are entitled to due process under the Fifth Amendment in deportation proceedings. The court ruled that deportation, while an administrative action, affects an individual's liberty and thus requires due process. This includes notice of the charges, an opportunity to be heard, and a fair hearing before an executive or administrative tribunal. The court emphasized that no person within U.S. jurisdiction can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Despite recognizing due process rights, the the court found that Yamataya had received sufficient process under the circumstances. The administrative hearing, though minimal, met the low threshold for due process at the time, as she was informed of the charges and allowed to present her case, albeit without counsel or an interpreter. Congress's authority. The court reaffirmed Congress's broad power to regulate immigration and deport aliens, but clarified that such power is subject to constitutional limits, particularly when an alien has established physical presence in the U.S. Outcome. Yamataya's deportation was upheld, as the court deemed the administrative process adequate, but the ruling set a precedent requiring due process in future deportation cases. Yamataya v. Fisher was a landmark case, explicitly extending Fifth Amendment due process protections to deportation proceedings for non-citizens within the U.S., regardless of their legal status. It built on Yikwo v. Hopkins, 1886, and Wong Wing v. United States, 1896, by applying due process to immigration enforcement. The case established that deportation, as a deprivation of liberty, requires at least minimal procedural safeguards: notice, a hearing, and an opportunity to present evidence. The ruling clarified that due process applies to aliens who have entered the U.S., even unlawfully, distinguishing them from those apprehended at the border who may have fewer protections. It set a baseline for administrative hearings, requiring fairness but allowing flexibility in immigration contexts, unlike the stricter standards for criminal trials. Yamataya laid the groundwork for modern deportation procedures, influencing the development of immigration courts and the right to a hearing before an immigration judge. The decision required immigration authorities to provide basic due process in deportation proceedings, such as notice and a hearing, improving fairness for non-citizens. However, Yamataya herself was deported, reflecting the limited practical impact for her case. The ruling did not mandate robust protections, like access to counsel or interpreters. Yamataya shaped immigration law by establishing due process as a constitutional requirement for deportation, influencing cases like Zadvydas v. Davis and Plyler v. Doe. It contributed to the development of the Immigration and Nationality Act, INA, of 1952, which formalized deportation procedures, including hearings before immigration judges and appeals to the Board of Immigration Appeals. The case's emphasis on physical presence within the U.S. remains relevant, distinguishing deportable aliens with due process rights from excludable aliens at the border with fewer protections. In 2025, Yamataya is frequently cited in legal challenges to deportation practices, particularly when immigrants are denied hearings or face expedited removal without adequate process. For example, advocates reference it to argue for fair hearings in asylum cases or mass deportation efforts. Posts on X discussing Yamataya highlight its role in protecting immigrant rights, though some note its limitations in modern contexts, where expedited removal and border enforcement restrict due process for recent arrivals. Minimal standards. The court set a low bar for due process, accepting Yamataya's summary hearing as adequate despite her lack of counsel, interpreter, or full understanding of the process. This allowed continued administrative discretion in deportation. Historical context. The ruling did not address broader anti-Asian policies, such as alien land laws or later Japanese internment during World War II, limiting its impact on systemic discrimination. Modern challenges. The case's protections are less effective in contexts like expedited removal or border detentions, where due process is curtailed. Additionally, the lack of a right to appointed counsel in immigration proceedings remains a significant gap. Yamataya v. Fisher, 1903, arose from the summary deportation of Kaoru Yamataya, a Japanese immigrant deemed a public charge shortly after entering the U.S. The Supreme Court's unanimous ruling upheld her deportation but established that non-citizens within the U.S., even those who entered unlawfully, are entitled to Fifth Amendment due process in deportation proceedings, including notice and a fair hearing. The case set a foundational precedent for procedural fairness in immigration enforcement, influencing modern deportation procedures while highlighting the limits of early 20th century protections. Once again, I'm Machine Pun Kelly, aka MPK. Thanks for watching. If you want to watch the next chapter, remember to click like and subscribe, and bookmark the Supreme Court playlist to keep up with all the videos in this series.